Welcome to another episode of the Asian Media and Information and Communication Center AMIC's series on Asian communication issues. Today we are going to take a global perspective on the issue of a New World Information and Communication Order, or NWICO. What we are looking at is the question whether it could be reincarnated today. Because when the campaign for a New World Information and Communication Order started in the late 1960s, it was a far different world with regards to communication technology. Satellite television was still science fiction. Internet was even not thought about. But when satellite technology was science fiction, there was fears within developing countries that satellite broadcasting could infringe on the sovereignty of developing countries. And that was a trigger for the launch or the start of this campaign for a New World Information and Communication Order. Now today, satellite broadcasting is part of everyday life for most people around the world, and so is internet. So have these fears been vindicated by this new technology, or has it provided us new opportunities? Then also, are the principles in the midst of all this, are the principles of NWICO still valid? Let me put the first question, whether the principles of NWICO are still valid. Maybe, Carl, I may put this to you first, because you have been talking and writing about this for so long.
Well, if you look at the original principles and read them against today's realities, actually they are still valid, I would say. It's true that the world has changed, but in some respects the north-south imbalance still remains and even has been aggravated by the globalization developments in some respects. Media technology is certainly different. The whole notion of cyberspace with the internet has emerged out of the ocean of nowhere into an island which seems to somehow occupy the whole of us gradually, at least in our research attention. But still, I would say that the principles of global equality or imbalance, respect for authentic cultures and interests of peoples and so on, they still remain pretty much the same.
It is relevant, it is much more relevant today than ever before. When this issue was raised, there was a bipolar world. Today is a unipolar world. And in the unipolar world, the fears are much more than ever before.
This really is the moment of opportunity to continue the debate. In fact, it is very relevant, it is proper, it is useful, and I believe it should be on the continuum.
When the campaign for a New World Information and Communication Order began in the late 60s and 70s, the argument was mainly based on free flow versus a two-way balanced flow. Now, the Western countries were always arguing for a free flow, while the developing countries were arguing for a balanced flow. Now, how do you see the issues today?
I see the issues not very different from how I saw them then. I agree with many of the principles that have been outlined by my colleagues here. I'm very sceptical as to how you can impose an order in the world of information. Certainly, when there was a bipolar world and the flow of information was from the rich Western to other countries, and there was a kind of alliance between the communists and the third world, because the communists obviously projected themselves as the champions of the underdogs. But we now have a much more complicated world in which the problem that I had with the World Information Order, namely that how do you actually implement it, is a much bigger problem, both because we have a multipolar world, or as you said, a unipolar world, we have one or the other, and we have so many more media platforms. So whilst I'm admiring the thought underneath it, and whilst recognizing that globalization and new technology has in some respects increased the divide between rich and poor, I think we have a much more complicated situation, because there are areas of all countries, as someone was saying, which are very rich and sophisticated.
working for Western media organizations like the BBC and AP, and for IPS. Now, IPS, you were trying to do exactly what NWICO campaigners were trying to do. So how do you see it now, looking back on your experience?
Well, Interpress was probably the prototype of the kind of news agency that the NWICO was envisaging. But along the way, there were many mistakes made. For example, the non-aligned news pool, for example, was set up, which just became an exchange of press releases among governments. You know, there was this emphasis on positive journalism, which actually undermined the credibility of media itself. So IPS was trying to do it in a very professional way. I agree that the need for NWICO now is more relevant than ever before, because the questions of ownership and control are more entrenched. The whole internet and the digital divide has brought up the question of control over the internet and who dominates it. But it also throws up a lot more opportunities than we had in the 70s for resistance, for alternative voices. Just look at the way television is proliferating in South India, or look at the new international TV channels like Al Jazeera, which give you an alternative viewpoint. So the technology that we blame is also giving us the opportunity to use it if we dare and if we can, and also gives us the challenge of not making that mistake that we did then and doing it with our credibility and our professionalism intact.
Now, one of the issues which was also debated quite a lot during the NWIC campaign, especially in the 70s, was this idea of universal news values, which Western media was basically arguing, versus cultural perspectives. Now, developing countries said there are cultural perspectives which influence news values, where the Western media, especially the American media, was trying to say that there are certain universal news values. Now, we had the other day UNESCO launching journalism education curriculum, and Binod, you asked if it was a conspiracy to make it universal. How do you see it?
This is an imposition of the same movement of unipolar world. If you recall, United States of America withdrew from UNESCO on that very issue, if I remember correctly, and did not come back to UNESCO when this was imposed on them. And the moment you begin to talk again this issue, there will be fireworks again. Number two, that it has never moved beyond talk.
The question which Binod put in the plenary when this model curriculum was launched was very proper. I'm happy he placed it, because it's a fundamental. Whether this implies suggestion by UNESCO in modern world, a kind of new universalism. And I have a bit divided opinion on this. On the one hand, I do believe that there are certain universal elements and values, even in media world, even in journalism. I was involved myself in the 80s together with all regional and international organizations of journalists to create a set of principles which was called International Principles for Professional Ethics in Journalism. And we could agree between all the creeds of journalism on a set of very fundamental principles.
I don't see it as an imposition. I see it as a guideline. If you can, or a minimum standard. You can take some, you can reject them, you can reject the entire one and the entire document. However, I think that we should not be talking about balanced information. Yes, information can be free from the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. But in terms of balance, this time not mathematical balance or mathematical equation, it cannot be, because of the technological know-how, and also because of developing countries are faced. So there must be a need of reciprocity of technology and reciprocity of cultural particularities and cultural peculiarities in discussing the free and balanced flow of information from the northern hemisphere and the southern. Yes, it could be free.
We do have a kind of paradox. On the one hand, attempt to create a universal awareness of media world and promote core ideas such as curricula for training. On the other hand, need for recognition of increased diversity. And I think both deserves to be remembered and promoted.
I'd like to just draw a contrast between two things. On the one hand, we have genuine concerns at a kind of political, cultural, social level about imbalance. On the other hand, when you get practical journalists to sit down together, you get a lot of agreement, a surprising large measure of agreement on certain principles. Obviously, on the edges, there are differences of view about the citizen role of the journalist and the professional, cold journalistic role, and so on. And there are differences of view about the extent to which culture should play a part in journalistic judgments. But there's a surprising degree of agreement. And what I find difficult is to get this disjunction between what the journalists themselves are saying from all cultures and the political realities which you rightly describe. The other point I'd make is that we now have huge opportunities for contraflow. And if Fox News is putting out things which really are outrageous in the opinion of many, there are other organisations which are now able to answer back in different languages. So I would see, I'm perhaps more optimistic than most of my colleagues have been about achieving a balance of news flows.
Punda, you had this experience as the IPS regional director in the 1990s, just after the Gulf War, when you were trying to market IPS to Asian editors as an alternative to the propaganda you got from the Pentagon during the Gulf War. Now, but you came across a branding, question of branding, isn't it, vis-a-vis the Western news agencies?
Yeah, people would say knee-jerk that, oh, you're anti-Western. I said, no, I'm not anti-Western, I'm just un-Western. And the fact that there is an alternative perspective, strangely enough, it was easier to sell then, because it was so black and white. Now it's, I don't know, there's all these nuances and there's all these different viewpoints. It's unipolar in a way, but it's also multipolar. Yes. And therefore it's much more difficult to sell. Also, you compete with the internet. You compete with the multifarious voices that exist out there. And but therefore it is actually much more difficult to sell something like IPS today, I think, than it was then, because there it was fairly logical that you would have an un-Western point of view.
But didn't you come across also another problem where editors in Asia especially found it more credible to use Reuters or AFP byline than IPS?
That was a question of, editors, probably because of their colonial mindset, would rather use AFP or Reuters or AP than a relatively unknown agency like IPS. But I think we managed in 5 or 6 years to make a brand out of it, that you could have an alternative news agency that was also credible and as professional, and give you at that time a news agency version of Al Jazeera, if you like,